So I'm Mark, that's Brian, and over there is the Northwest Horticultural Council's new logo. We've never had a logo before, and you're seeing it for the first time here today. Brian and I are going to take about the next 20 minutes or so to talk about a project that the NHC and Moss Adams worked on most of this past year. It's somewhat in keeping with the theme of the meeting this year, navigating adversity, but as Jeff rightly pointed out, perhaps more on the side of adversity than anything else. But the point is to inform you about the real-world data that we collected so that everyone has the same information to use when telling our story and seeking changes, and that is, wherever the receptive voice can be, or ears can be heard. Could be at the state level with John Devaney, could be at the national level with U.S. Apple or Northwest Horticultural Council, could be in public relations. We need to tell our story, as John rightly pointed out. The project was born out of discussions that we had with our workforce advisory committee, and that started roughly a year ago. They're the folks that are in the trenches every day, dealing with labor, dealing with the workforce, and give us advice on how to advocate and how to represent our industry on the regulatory side. So what we were hearing and continue to hear from folks that are decision makers in Washington, D.C. is how when we're arguing for changes to immigration policy or changes to the guest worker program, they tell us that, your anecdotal stories are helpful, but they're simply not enough. Some elected officials and their staff want to see the data and that substantiates our claims. So we developed a proposal. Where's my clicker here? We developed a proposal that the NHC trustees approved back in February. And honestly, it's fairly simple. We want to verify through the collection of empirical data the anecdotal claims that the growth in the adverse effect wage rate and or the prevailing wage is economically unsustainable. The resulting increase in labor costs has lowered grower margins, forcing growers out of business. And absent an AWR and or prevailing wage rate freeze or reform to the methodology used to calculate that, additional family farms will be forced to exit the industry in the near term. So again, it wasn't that complicated on the face of it. Collect confidential apple grower business information, confidential business information, that'll demonstrate the trends of grower returns and labor costs since 2013. Our contractor partners were McDermott, Will & Emery. That's a legal firm that is counsel for us and advised us on legal issues related to data collection and review. And then McDermott contracted with Moss Adams for the aggregation and technical analysis of the data. Growers and packers were responsible for providing their data, which was significant. A lot of back office hours, which maybe Brian will tell you more about. We at the Northwest Horticultural Council didn't receive or review any of the direct responses from the packers or growers, and obviously confidentiality was the highest priority. So McDermott and Moss Adams retain all the business confidential grower. What we saw was the yearly aggregated and anonymized raw data compiled from the various responses that came in from growers and packers. So at this point, with that background, I'll turn it over to Brian so he can explain what Moss Adams did and where these data points come from.
Thanks, Mark. Way back when, I guess we got a call from Mark and wanted to do a study or get some data related to the compression shrink that was happening to the orchard operating margins and profitability. And, at that point, it's like, well, why really get a hold of an accounting firm like Moss Adams and say, can you do a study for us, when I think we all know that, and the data is out there that kind of supports that position when you're talking about the price information that's out there that we're selling apples for, the volume information that's out there, the labor rates that we're dealing with, the inflation that we're dealing with. I mean, you kind of do it on the back of a napkin and you know that we're making less and the compression is happening, and you probably guess that the trend line over a period of time is actually real, and it's like, okay, what other data do you need? And Mark kind of explained to me how bureaucrats work and explained that we need actual empirical data that will support the story. And so once we figured that out, it was like a team at Moss Adams put together, and we decided to, figure out how to tell that story by looking at trend lines over a period of time. So what we did is we decided on multiple factors, but we tried to figure out what is the actual end game that's going to support how to show compression on profit margins. And so we said the industry generally uses bins, and the industry usually has pretty good return per bin, and the industry has real-time labor reporting and is generally pretty accurate about that. But as you all know, that we're kind of a tax accounting driven industry, and therefore the expenses are recorded in one year and the income is reported in the next year. So we said if we can just focus on apples and ignore cherries and pears, and if we can just focus on orchards that generally don't have a lot of transition in them, like replanting or other varieties in them, then we should probably be able to get pretty good trend line data if we can get enough people to participate and tell their story to us in numbers over time. So we were able to find those people, and they were willing to give us all their information related to every apple pool closing for that orchard over a 10-year period, and also the labor related to those producing those apples in the previous year. So the slide that you're looking at now shows that 10 years across the top, and it shows the grower net returns. And pretty stable industry stuff for those net returns, because everybody can relate to that. And then the next one worked. Shows where we captured the labor data, and we got H2A labor data and we got non-H2A labor data, put it together with all the taxes and all the benefits, and then we added the actual additional H2A labor cost to come up with the total cost of that labor, and then we converted that to the cost per bin, which we know what was harvested from that apple orchard. And then we did the comparison to try to figure out, okay, if we made, got these net returns of revenue per bin, apple bin, and we compared it to the wage per bin, then we would have a pretty meaningful trend line over a period of time. Now, we all know that it's going to go up and down because of the efficiencies of labor and the increasing yields per orchard. But over a 10-year period, it should have a trend line that would tell the story, and it did. And then, once we produced the report, then we said, well, 2023, you don't have that crop in here yet, and that's a very challenging crop, which we all know. And so we went back to the participants and said, okay, can you give us the data in 2023, because we know what the labor cost was to harvest it, but we didn't have the full returns settled yet. But by the time we went back to that second ask, they were 80–90% complete on those returns, and so we feel pretty good about those estimates as well. So, and then we added some other data points on there just for intrigue, and again, it tells a pretty interesting story that can be taken to government officials. I'll turn it back over to Mark for those results.
Great. Thanks, Brian. So we can get into some of the results now, run through those quickly, but first I wanted to thank the Good Fruit Grower for helping us. Some of these slides come from their December issue, which is out, and thank Kate Pryman and Jared Johnson. They really put a lot of work into the next couple of slides and the article in general. So if you haven't read it, please do. As we all know, and Brian referenced, the per bin measurements fluctuate, whether that's on the expense side or the return side, based on the crop size. So what you have here is the returns and how they jump around, and then the overall crop size. Pretty straightforward stuff. This one is a little bit more complicated. The labor escalator, I guess, is what we've been referring to, describing it as. You got a number of different things going on there. I'll start working from the bottom of the slide up. First, the AWR, which everybody's aware of, that adverse effect wage rate is up 60% basically since 2013. The next line up is ECI, and I'll say a few more words about that in a second. Then you have the labor cost per bin, again, the jagged line, but also definitely increasing as that trend line, the other big kind of pink line shows. In terms of ECI, what we wanted is some sort of a measurement of inflation. You know, what could we use? And we settled on the U.S. Department of Labor, U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics Employment Cost Index. So I don't know how many people have ever heard of this thing, but ECI measures the change in hourly labor cost to employers over time. It's a national measurement. And it uses a fixed basket, so it's the same basket year over year, that includes both the cost of wages, salaries, and the cost of benefits. So if H-2A wages had followed ECI during this time period, growers would have faced roughly a 33% increase instead of what they actually faced, which was a 127% increase. Other than that huge difference, why do we care? Well, ECI was used to govern wage differences and govern the wage increases that would have been established in 2013 under an agricultural guest worker program that was passed by the Senate and supported by Senator Murray back then. But it was not passed by the House of Representatives, and I think that everybody knows the story that has played out over the years. Since then, to be fair, you know, the House passed the Agricultural Workforce Modernization Act twice, and the Senate failed to act on that. So there's not picking sides here, but regardless, neither side has come up with a solution that is passed. And ECI was what was originally proposed as the escalator for wages. Would have made a significant difference if they had. This is, you know, one of the results. It's scary, I think. It won't frighten you all because you've been living it. But in 2013, labor costs consumed an average of 37% of the grower return check. By 2022, it had increased to 70%. And the estimate for 2023 is it's 99%. A reminder for those of you that may not know, labor costs are roughly 50 to 60%, depending on who you talk to, of grower production costs. So there's, Jeff, you mentioned $100 per bin, so that people are losing, and that's not surprising. All right, leads us to this next slide, and this one isn't as pretty. I did it, so or Moss Adams did it, I guess I should put credit there. The net return is blue. The labor costs are in orange. You see the trend line, which is dotted, versus the yearly one, which is more jagged. I call it the squeeze or the margin squeeze. It's a pinch point. It's certainly not what you want to see, but it demonstrates what Brian pointed out earlier. Growers saw the money they received for their fruit increase about 22%. So that's net returns did grow over that time frame, while labor costs, as I said before, increased 127%. So this 22% increase, if you know, as a reference, it's about 2.4% a year. Social Security adjustments ran about 19% during the same time. So you're 1.9% there. You're beating Social Security adjustments barely in your returns, but it's obviously far outpassed and outflanked by the cost of labor. Okay, so in conclusion, I think that, you know, what we set out to demonstrate empirically, we did. We have enough evidence that shows over time how returns they did increase, then they pretty much plateaued. Labor costs have not changed at all. They continue on the upward trend. But we needed another data point, right? We said family farms were going out of business, and that's not something that the NHC can collect. It's very difficult to establish what businesses went out of business. I think, as John Devaney's aptly pointed out before, there's no for sale sign generally. You go by, and in many cases, the orchard still is in place. But USDA, NASS does and can, and their surveys show that in Washington State, the number of fruit and nut farms that produced a crop went down by 15% between 2017 and 2022. In Oregon, the number of apple and pear farms dropped by 27%, cherry farms dropped by 29%, and we know the situation is worse now than it was in 2022. With that, it isn't intended to be an uplifting speech. It's a reality talk and of the information that we have and how we can use that to represent industry, whether you're in Olympia, whether you're in Washington, D.C. It's unsustainable. And what we need our elected officials to do to stop that labor escalator is to make some decisions, keep tree fruit growers in business, and not just the growers, but everybody that they employ. So you're free to use any of this data. Again, it's in the Good Fruit Grower. Reach out to John Devaney or myself, our staffs, if you're planning to give a talk or go visit somebody, and happy to give it to you. Thank you.